welcome to the Lucky Campbell Show. Tonight, I'm on the campus of St. FX University. And more specifically, the Schwartz School Auditorium. I'm here tonight to observe Dr. Burnley Rocky Jones giving a lecture in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It is an honor for me to videotape this historic event, and I hope you will enjoy it.
So, as you know, Martin Luther King is best known for his 1963 famous speech, I Have a dream of a racially equitable society. King was the chief spokesman for nonviolent activism in the civil rights movement, which successfully protested racial discrimination in federal and state laws. He is indeed one of the major key players who has prompted the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In the same year, he received a Nobel Peace Prize for his work to end racial segregation through civil disobedience and other non-violence means. Nova Scotia adopted its first human rights legislation in '67. But at home in Canada, there was also a civil rights movement, and I think Rocky Jones was part of it. In fact, he became one of the best-known freedom fighters in the Canadian civil rights movement.
To quote Dr. King, "We will have to repent in this generation not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." So his legacy surrounds us. His dreams are our reality, but our dreams are our future. So have one.
We are all here today to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy. One of Dr. King's main tactics during the civil rights movement included the use of civil disobedience instead of violence.
And also, you know, as I get older and I go through some trial and tribulations, I'd say more importantly to me, he's a very wise man. He gives me a lot of advice around ways to navigate life and make some right decisions. So I really appreciated that and love him for that. And in closing, I'd like to give a statement or a quote from Dr. Stanley R. Barrett, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Guelph. And I think this really sums up the man who's going to come speak after I stop talking. He says, "I have known Rocky Jones for almost 40 years, and I've been associated with him in several activities. In addition, in my capacity as a Canadian historian, I've researched and written about his role in the evolution of human rights in Canada. I can think of few living Canadians who have done more to further the cause of racial equality and the rights of the disadvantaged in our country than Mr. Rocky Jones." Thank you.
Wow, that's a hard act to follow. I must say, I have such incredible pride to be introduced by my son. You know, I mean, when you are a parent, you know, and you raise, you know, a baby, and the baby to a child, and the child to a teenager, and the teenager to a young man, and then after that they're making their own way in life. You kind of take on a bit of their life, so you live through your children, and those of you who have children know what I'm talking about. I was just saying the other day, at one time, I was Elmer Jones's son, and Willina Jones's son, and that was how I was identified when I was in Truro. And then after that, after Tracy was born and started to school, I became Tracy's father. And then when Augie and Patty and Shaka were playing basketball, I was identified as the boys' father. And then later on, I had grandchildren. And now I'm identified as their grandfather. And I wonder, well, who am I? I mean, why? You know, you lose your identity when you have children. But it's one of the most beautiful things that can happen to you. It's just so wonderful. And to see, you know, Augie stand up as a very competent, articulate, you know, man who is in his own right a scholar and a leader gives me great pride. I can't say enough, and I'm so pleased to have had this opportunity. I will be very personal tonight. This will be a sort of a different kind of a talk, I think. I was quite taken with the questions that were asked at the beginning, and I do obviously want to really thank the organizers who've put this together, particularly Rashida, who has had to put up with my disorganization. You know, I say to my grandchildren all the time, age has its privileges. And one of the privileges you have as you get older is the excuse that you've just forgotten. And you can get away with almost anything, saying, oh, I forgot, you know, it's old age. And so this is part of what I can say. I want to try to see if I can give you an overview of the formation of the Nova Scotian African community, so that you will have a sense of this is who we're talking about. This is the African Nova Scotian community. These are the people, where they came from, etc. So that is one of the things I do want to do. I want to talk about that formation. I want to talk about perhaps the what I see as the relationship that was mentioned between this community in Antigonish, this university, with the African Nova Scotian community that surrounds it, and see if I can make some sense of that. I want to talk about what it was like to grow up in Nova Scotia as a black kid in a predominantly white society that was indeed a very racist society. And I want to see if I can give you a sense of what I went through and how that felt. And then I want to talk to you about the development and evolution of the Canadian civil rights movement and contrast that with the American movement and the organizations that evolved in the States and the organizations that were parallel and evolving in Nova Scotia. And in doing that, I want to talk to you about some of the personalities that were involved. And I guess finally, in terms of all of that, which is more than what I imagine I can really get through in the time allotted, I want to enter into a discussion about philosophy and where we may stand and where our future may lie. I want to say that our community here, the Nova Scotian community, it's a community that is born because we are a people and not because we are individuals. You know, a lot of times communities get formed because families come as individual families and they reside there, and another family comes, and that eventually a community is formed. We were formed because there were major groups who came to Nova Scotia. In the first instance, there were individuals who came as interpreters, but they didn't form communities. We can acknowledge that we had interpreters, and you know, in the 15th century, we had African interpreters who came to Nova Scotia. But the major movements that happened, we had the Loyalists, 1783 and 1784, if you're into dates. The Black Loyalists arrive in Nova Scotia. Now, what's interesting about this group is there's approximately 3,000 Black Loyalists. At the same time, there are approximately 30,000 white Loyalists. And there are an additional 1,200 slaves. So during this time period, in Nova Scotia, you have all of these people arriving. And you might say, well, why would we have slaves and free persons arriving at the same time? And I think it's important to understand who we are today to have a sense of who we were yesterday in our beginnings here. When the Loyalists came, they came because they were invited by the British to join the British lines. And in essence, the offer was, we will offer freedom to any rebel-owned slave. Any rebel-owned slave. And as such, if you were a slave in the States and your owner was a rebel and you made it to the British lines, you were guaranteed your freedom. If, on the other hand, you were a slave and your owner was loyal to Britain, the offer was not open to you. So you can imagine that it was not a humanitarian initiative. It had nothing to do with the British desire to free the slaves. It was a military initiative designed to weaken the rebels. If you can imagine, I mean, you know, say, a slave might have been worth $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. Now, all of a sudden, this person, which is property, is going to walk away, join the British, and be free. That means that that rebel who owned them has just lost a whole lot of money. Additionally, if you're enslaved, if you are enslaved and you know that you can get freedom, but standing in the way of your freedom is this master, then you will do anything to that person to gain your freedom. So that means that the rebels were certainly afraid of what was happening with the people they had enslaved. Moreover, these people who joined the British were able to bring with them the knowledge of what was happening in the rebel camps, in rebel plantations. So they could come and they could say, well, Jack Jones, he has this stored here, he has that stored there, this is how many guns he's got, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they were a good source of information and great guides. So the British, in offering freedom to these people, with this military strategy, were placed in a very awkward situation. Because, if you can imagine, and I'm taking some time to let you understand, I'm trying to paint a picture. If you can imagine a free black and an enslaved black. If you can imagine a rebel-owned slave and a slave owned by a master that was loyal to Britain. Okay, so these two black people come to the ship. And the checker is there. They actually had checkers to check them off. Well, who's your name? Who's your owner? Jack Jones. Jack Jones was a rebel. Yes. Come on board, you're a free man. And who's your owner? Sid Jones. Oh. Sid Jones is one of ours. He's loyal to Britain. You're welcome to come on board, but you're still a slave. Same time, same place, same people, treated differently. And when these people arrived, the Loyalists in Nova Scotia, they were seen as a source of cheap but readily available labor. And I submit to you that from the time the Loyalists arrived in 1783 and 1784, the perception of the role of African Nova Scotians has not changed. We are still seen as a source of cheap but readily available labor. And when you look at the towns in Nova Scotia, and you will see where the African Nova Scotian people have settled and have been given their land and have been forced to live. We live primarily on the outskirts of all of the towns. And I want to say cities, but we only have, I think, 2 cities in Nova Scotia, Sydney and Halifax. But even on the cities, with the exception of Sydney, but certainly in Halifax, we lived on the outskirts. And I'm sure all of you perhaps have seen the pictures of the black people coming into town to work in the city of Halifax. And they would come into town from Preston, North Preston, East Preston, Cherrybrook, Hammonds Plains, Beachville, you name it. The people would come into town during the day. They'd do the work. They'd scrub the floors. They'd look after the white people's children. And at night, they would go back to their own homes and have to look after their own stuff. And that's been our role, and that continues to be our role. And we, as a people, have continued to fight to change that role. But you know, I always say, and Augie touched on this, in order to make change, we must have coalitions. We must have coalitions. I can't do it all by myself. African Nova Scotians will never be able to do it all by themselves. We need the support of the larger community. The problem has been, of course, is the support of the larger community is so messed up. It's so messed up because the people in the white community basically have wanted to come into the black community to organize the black community to tell us how to do what we got to do. And that's like saying somebody is beating me up and I'm on the ground and someone comes by and says, can I help you? What can I do to help you? And the person is still beating me. What you got to do is stop the person from beating me. So in the white community, there's got to be a movement, an effort to challenge white society. There's got to be an effort to challenge the powers that be on the decisions they make. And that's one of the reasons I think that we have not changed Nova Scotian society. One of the reasons is that we have not had that groundswell of support from within the Caucasian community. There's been times when within the black community that we have struggled, we've marched, we've done all kinds of things. And the bottom line is, you know, we're what? 4 or 5% of the population at best? We're not going to change the government. We're not going to change the economic situation. We're not going to change things without your support. So part of the challenge that I roll out as I'm speaking tonight is the challenge of you, as Caucasian or white people, Europeans, to become involved in helping to bring about change in our province. The other group that arrives is when I say we come as groups, and I'm very conscious of the time. There's so much. I've taken on such a big role here tonight, a big job of things I want to talk about. But before I leave the Loyalists, I do want to say that the Loyalists were promised land. And they were promised that they would receive 100 acres of land. Basically speaking, they were given 10 acres of land. And as such, the 10 acres was really not enough to become self-sufficient. And not only were they not able to become self-sufficient, they were given what was called tickets of location. So rather than having freehold title, these tickets of location meant that the title to the land was retained by the government, and the people only got free title if they improved the land to the satisfaction of a government agent, and then when they got free title, they could then use their land as collateral. So you can imagine the difficulty of trying to work all day in a town, come back, and clear your own land and build a place to live, enough so that you could get free title, so that you could use your land as collateral. It just didn't happen. Land wasn't big enough. They didn't get their title to the land. They couldn't use the land as collateral. So therefore, the community was impoverished and held in that poverty. Eventually, with the Loyalists, they petitioned the government in England, and John Clarkson, who was a representative of the Sierra Leone Company, which was a company similar to the Hudson's Bay Company, which I'm sure you all know about, and they wanted settlers to go to Africa. They wanted to, the Sierra Leone Company wanted to establish what I'll call a beachhead. They wanted to colonize the African colony, and they needed and wanted people who could speak English, who were Christian, and who they could manipulate. So they came to Nova Scotia, and they talked to the Loyalists, and they eventually convinced the Loyalists that they would never get satisfaction here in Nova Scotia, and they should go back to Africa, which they did. The problem was that when they got to Africa, that didn't work either. That's a whole other story that we'll go into later on. But that was the story of the Loyalists. The Maroons, which was another group that came in 1796 and stayed for a 4-year period. The Maroons are, I think, the most exciting group in the history of African Nova Scotian history. They came from Jamaica. They had lived in the hills of Jamaica, in fact, in the Trelawney area of Jamaica. They fought 184 intermittent years of warfare against the Jamaican and imperial government. And that's not to say that they fought 184 years all the way through. So they have 2 years of war, 10 years of war, 5 years of war, whatever. Went on for 184 years. Eventually, the Jamaican government, it's a whole long story to get there, but eventually the Jamaican government had them loaded on ships, and they thought they were being relocated within Jamaica. But in fact, the ships sailed, and the Jamaican government just wanted to get rid of these people because they were a real problem. I mean, they raided plantations, they stole slaves from plantations, they liberated people from within the island. Governor Wentworth at the time, when the Maroons were coming into the harbor, Governor Wentworth went out to inspect them because the Maroons were known for their fighting skills. So Wentworth goes out and he sees them, and if you can imagine, I mean, I can imagine, I don't know if you can, but you know, these guys were from the hills, back in the hills in Jamaica. They were dark, really dark skinned. I mean, only the strong survive in that situation. So the men were very muscular. They were polygamous because the men were being killed off as they were involved in all of these wars. So, you know, and they were well organized. And Wentworth goes out, inspects them, and sees these beautiful specimens and invites them to stay in Nova Scotia, which the Maroons do come in, they stay. But the problem was that the Maroons were loyal only to Maroons. The African Nova Scotians who were living in what today would be called Africville, where Africville was, living along the shores of the Bedford Basin, the Maroons beat them up. The people in the garrison, the military types, the Maroons beat them up. They settled them over in Preston, East Preston, the Wentworth estate, and in that area, they beat the people up. They built houses for them. The Maroons wouldn't work on the houses. They tore off the boards and used it for firewood. They said, a Maroon cannot live where the pineapple does not grow. They totally disrupted Nova Scotian society to such an extent that the people in Nova Scotia began to petition the imperial government in England to get rid of these Maroons. And Governor Wentworth had no choice but to round up, as they said at the time, every single Maroon, man, woman, and child to ship them back to Africa. They didn't get them all, but they sure as hell tried. And these people who were polygamous, who were not open to Christianity, who had their own ways and their own loyalties, had such an impact on the African Nova Scotians that even today, although the possibility is quite remote, that even today, many people from the Prestons believe that they are the descendants of the Maroons. You know, I mean, that's the admiration that's held for them. Finally, the last group of people who came were the refugees after the War of 1812. The people who came after the War of 1812 as refugees, they're mostly the ancestors of today's Nova Scotians. There has been intermarriage and between the Loyalists who stayed and the refugees who came, so that today many people, African Nova Scotians, would be able to say that they're definitely descendants of the refugees, and some can say they're descendants of the Loyalists. Now, in terms of this area, in Guysborough, Sunnyvale, Leaconville, Upper Big Tracadie, there was a huge Loyalist community. This was a Loyalist area here. And for whatever reason, and Jim Walker and I have debated this and tried to figure it out, and perhaps a historian will be able to give us an answer in the near future, the people from this area did not take advantage of Clarkson's offer to go back to Africa. They didn't leave from this area. Now, the question is did they hear about it? I would argue they had to have heard about it. They had to have heard about it, but for some reason, the people here were satisfied enough that they did not want to leave and go back to Africa. So it's one of the areas where the Loyalist community almost remained intact. So that the people from this area today would mostly be descendants of the Loyalists. The interesting thing, too, in terms of the university and these communities, we do have the Cody Institute here. And we've brought scholars from all over the world, particularly Africa, to St. FX. Right here we have Lincolnville, Sunnyvale, Upper Big Tracadie, which are really oppressed and depressed communities, crying out for assistance and help. At one time, I do recall that they had a kiln here, and there was something else that was going in the area. But generally speaking, this area and the African Nova Scotians here are still a source of cheap and not so readily available labor. And yet we have the Cody, which is able to go around the world and train people about development and how to develop communities. And our communities here are totally underdeveloped. So the question was asked at the beginning, why do we have no counselors on council? My answer to that would be that in this particular area, as much as you may not like it, they wouldn't feel welcome. African Nova Scotians would not feel welcome on this council. Why are there no clerks in stores? I would imagine that the same as other places. This is no different from the Deep South. You know, there's no clerks in the stores because the stores don't hire them. And why don't they hire them? Because the bottom line is the owners think, well, if I hire African Nova Scotians, maybe it's going to affect my bottom line financially. Whereas the reality of it is we've seen all over North America that doesn't happen. There's no reason why we shouldn't have young people from these communities and from within Antigonish working as clerks in the stores here. What about the staff at St. FX? Well, I'm sure that there are many people of African descent who've applied for jobs here. I can't speak to why they haven't got it, but the proof of the pudding is in the pie. The bottom line is, if it walks like a duck, squawks like a duck, and looks like a duck, it's likely a duck, and so it's likely racism. You know, no black studies here. Why shouldn't there be black studies? You've got one of the richest black communities, historical black communities in the whole province. It's the only place in this province where we know, there's a huge loyalist community. And no one has studied it, no one knows about it, and there's no scholarship that's directed directly toward it. The same as African Nova Scotian students. I'm not saying all of this to start a fight with St. FX. I'm saying this to say, look, we need your support. You know, we need you as professors, as students, as people in this community. We need you to ask these questions, not just within the confines of a lecture on Martin Luther King, but to ask these questions generally in the community and to help take a position on these issues. We cannot do it alone. So how do we do it? I wanted to read, in speaking of Martin Luther King, I wanted to read a letter that he had written. This letter has just come to light. It was written in September in 1956. And I will say at the beginning, it's consistent with his philosophy. And at that time, in the 50s and going into the 60s, I did not share Martin Luther King's philosophy, and I will talk about that. But this is what he had to say, and I hope I'm watching my clock and talking, and there's so much I want to say, and you know, and I want to say, I was there. I was there for these things that happened, you know, and there's a certain insight that I want to share with you, just simply because very few people at this point can share it. So it may take me a little time, and I just hope that you will put up with it. This is a letter from the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., President, and the Reverend W.J. Powell, Secretary of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the association that Dr. Martin Luther King was involved in before SCLC, the Student Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, This is a historic week because segregation on buses has now been declared unconstitutional. Within a few days, the Supreme Court mandate will reach Montgomery, and you will be reboarding integrated buses. This places upon us all a tremendous responsibility of maintaining, in the face of what could be some unpleasantness, a calm and loving dignity befitting good citizens and members of our race. If there is violence in word or deed, it must not be our people who commit it. For your help and convenience, the following suggestions are made. Will you read, study, and memorize them so that our nonviolent determination may not be endangered? First, some general suggestions. Now keep in mind this in the context of what we saw at the beginning of the evening. Not all white people are opposed to integrated buses, except goodwill on the part of many. The whole bus is now for the use of all people. Take a vacant seat. Pray for guidance and commit yourself to complete nonviolence in word and action as you enter the bus. Demonstrate the calm dignity of our Montgomery people in your actions. In all things, observe ordinary rules of courtesy and good behavior. Remember that this is not a victory for Negroes alone, but for all Montgomery and the South. Do not boast, do not brag. Be quiet but friendly. Proud but not arrogant. Joyous but not boisterous. Be loving enough to absorb evil and understanding enough to turn an enemy into a friend. Now for some specific suggestions. The bus driver is in charge of the bus and has been instructed to obey the law. Assume that he will cooperate in helping you occupy any vacant seat. Do not deliberately sit by a white person unless there is no other seat. In sitting down by a person, white or colored, say, "May I?" or "Pardon me" as you sit. This is common courtesy. If cursed, do not curse back. If pushed, do not push back. If struck, do not strike back, but evidence love and goodwill at all times. In case of an incident, talk as little as possible and always in a quiet tone. Do not get up from your seat. Report all serious incidents to the bus driver. For the first few days, try to get on the bus with a friend in whose nonviolence you have confidence. You can uphold one another by a glance or a prayer. If another person is being molested, do not arise to go to his defense, but pray for the oppressor and use moral and spiritual force to carry on the struggle for justice. According to your own ability and personality, do not be afraid to experiment with new and creative techniques for achieving reconciliation and social change. If you feel you cannot take it, walk for another week or two. We have confidence in our people. God bless you all. That is the philosophy that was articulated by Martin Luther King. And it was that kind of philosophy that those of us who were perhaps more militant rejected. In essence, the struggle between the nonviolent philosophies and the persons who said, if you hit me, I'm hitting you back, was very stark. It was extremely stark. In preparation for my talk, I just jotted down a few names that you might be familiar with so that you would see those who would agree with this. I mean, this letter, which is just coming to light, it's basically, Stokely was a very flamboyant person, extremely energetic, one of the brightest people you would ever possibly imagine. His mind was always working. He was asking questions. He just wanted to know the answer to every question that was ever out there. But he, Stokely, later Kwame Ture, could never in a million years sit and let someone hit him or beat him and he do nothing. We talked about it many times. So what they did was they organized a group, what they called the Deacons for Defense. And they said, we believe that nonviolence as a tactic can move the movement forward. We do not believe it as a philosophy. So those who believe in the philosophy and adopt it as a tactic, we will do our best to protect them. And that, to me, made sense. James Farmer, on the other hand, who was with CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, James Farmer was able to adopt it and accept it. Fannie Lou Hamer, some of you may have seen, she, in fact, came to Nova Scotia, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was organized because African people of African descent, could not vote. And they were trying to organize the right to vote. And so they organized a special political party. And Julian Bond later became elected as a representative of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And they were indeed nonviolent and adopted the philosophy. Malcolm X could never and did never adopt the philosophy of nonviolence. Malcolm X, I think, was one of the greatest intellectuals and leaders between him and Walter Rodney of the African American movement, in the sense that they wrote and they talked about the difference between violence and nonviolence. And they talked about the need to organize. And there's a sense that I have that in my evolution, my personal evolution, I started off believing in integration. And when I came to Nova Scotia back home, Augie, you said 65, I think it was actually 66 that we actually came. I believed in integration. I believed that if we had an integrated movement, we would be able to change this society. And as such, we had white workers and black workers who came as organizers in the community. As we tried to organize within the community and as we began to face the racism that we faced every day in Nova Scotia, I began to realize more and more and more that we as African people had to organize ourselves. That it did not make sense to have white organizers moving into the black community to try to organize when the white community was just being left and no one was talking to the white people. So I began to change my philosophy, not only in terms of violence versus nonviolence, but in terms of what role people could play in the development of a social movement. And although I do believe, even to this day, that there's a need for everyone to be involved in the movement, I still am of the impression and belief that we must organize in our own communities to liberate those communities. That it doesn't make sense for me to try to go into the white community to try to explain to the white community why they are oppressing me. They know why they are oppressing me. It takes someone from the white community to go into the white community to say, hey, we take ownership of this issue. We as Caucasian people own this issue of racism and oppression, and we will deal with our people to try to flush it out and to change it. And I will go into the African Nova Scotian or the black community, and I will say to our people, look, we have got to do this, 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 and this. So I still adopt that philosophy. In the Canadian movement, we had different personalities. At the same time as in the States, you have Stokely, you have James Farmer, Fannie Hamer, Jim Lewis, Julian Bond, Du Bois, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Eldridge Cleaver, Kathleen Cleaver. On the Canadian side, particularly in Nova Scotia, we have names like Gus Wedderburn, Carrie Bess, Calvin Ruck, Viola Desmond, W.P. Oliver, Buddy Day, Donnie Oliver, B.A. Husbands, Alonzo Reddick, Ada Fells, Brad Barton, Kenny Fells, Rosie Douglas, who was here for a while, Dorothy Wills, who was out of Montreal, Howard McCurdy out of Windsor, and Lincoln Alexander out of Ontario. Within our group in Canada, we have the same divisions, identical divisions that were in the States in terms of philosophy and beliefs. And we had the same difficulties trying to organize. So the question is, with these divisions, philosophies and beliefs, what happened? Where does it leave us? What's it done? To jump back a bit, now I have 25 after 7. How much time do I have left? Pardon? About 8. 8 minutes? You want to leave a little time for questions? Okay. I've got until 8? I can talk until 8? Oh, okay. I won't talk until 8. It's not fair to you. But let's just take just because I've got this little bit of time, and I know that a lot of you are students and intellectuals, and perhaps interested in the evolution of the movement in Canada, let's just say this. The Canadian movement differs from the American movement in as much as the Canadian movement grows out of the peace movement. And that the peace movement in Canada gave rise, the Quakers were the strongest, most influential group and body in the Canadian civil rights movement. It was the Quakers in Toronto who influenced the young people who started this, the combined universities for nuclear disarmament, which came from the United States, and to Regina, the Regina Conference, which started the Students' Union for Peace Action, came out of the Quakers. And it was based on the philosophy of nonviolence and Christianity. And that's the real essence of the beginning of the Canadian civil rights movement. Nonviolence, Christianity. The American movement, on the other hand, grows out of struggle. The American movement grows out of the confrontations between the African American and the society they're living in. So they have the confrontations with the segregation of not being able to get into the restaurants, not being able to take advantages of services, and that gives rise to the militancy that we see evolve in the American movement. Given what I'm arguing are the two different genesis in terms of this evolution, and I'm not going back way back to in history. I'm talking after the Second World War and what happens there. Given the differences, why would it be that, if I am correct, that the Canadian movement is based on nonviolence, which I really believe it was, and Christianity, which I believe it was, and the American movement is based on conflict and confrontation, which I believe it was, why are the two movements evolving at the same time with the same kinds of philosophies? Why doesn't the Canadian movement continue in that spirit of nonviolence and Christianity? What happens to destroy that? Because it's gone. It's gone. That movement has just withered away. And we don't know why. Because what happens is we have the rise in Canada of a black nationalist movement that really overshadows the nonviolent peace movement. So from the time of 68, between 68 for about a period of 10 years, the Canadian peace movement is not as articulate or is not as visible as it had been prior to that, with the efforts at ban the bomb. There should be no nuclear proliferation. The USA is giving subs away. We do not want Polaris. The fight against the Polaris and all of that. So the black Canadian movement moves to the forefront of a Canadian movement, and yet black people are such a small minority. So why does that happen? I suggest a couple of things. One, I suggest that the leadership in the black community is extremely articulate and aggressive. Howard McCurdy, who's one of the leaders of the National Black Coalition of Canada, and who led a good part of the struggle during this period that I'm speaking of, Howard McCurdy would mesmerize you. He'd come into a room and he'd talk, and you were just transfixed with what Howard McCurdy would say. Lincoln Alexander, who also was at that time in the forefront of the black movement, was the same kind of personality. When he came into a room and he had to speak, he took it over. W.P. Oliver from Nova Scotia. When W.P. Oliver spoke, he just took over everything. So the leadership in the black community was so, and again, I'm choosing my words carefully. The leadership in the peace movement was not as aggressive nor as articulate as the leadership was in the black community at that time. So the black community leadership really took over. However, the conflict within our community became very, very, very severe. The conflict between The persons like W.P. Oliver, who was a minister, a Baptist minister in Nova Scotia, and myself, who, you know, I mean, I basically was a follower of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And whereas WP would say, you know, we certainly have got to turn the other cheek and show compassion, I say, no, if you hit me, I'm hitting you back. You know, you got your gun, I'll get mine. You know, well, you choose the weapon and I'll learn how to use it, but we will meet. No. I'm not, you know, I am not turning the other cheek. And so we would be in a meeting and WP would speak and you'd see the people, you know, they'd understand what he was saying. They go there. And then I would speak and they go. So the community was continually trying to figure out where they stood vis-a-vis violence and nonviolence. When Rosie Douglas, I mean, some of you may have known, Rosie later became the Prime Minister of Dominica. And he was one of the students at the Sir George Williams when the computer, we had the computer party, as we called it, with the computers burnt at Sir George Williams University. And Rosie was a student then and was deported by the Canadian government. But Rosie was so articulate. But Rosie was a stone, steady, heavy Marxist who did not agree with nonviolence. When Dr. Martin Luther King did the Massey lectures in Canada, for Canada, I was invited to critique them. And, you know, my critique was, he's out of his mind to adopt a position where he should turn the other cheek and let people hit him and say, God forgive them for they know not what they do. Screw that. They know what they're doing. They're hitting you and they intend to hurt you. And if you take it, you're a fool. And that was the difference in the philosophy. So today, where are we? I don't know. The truth of the matter is, within the community, there is no political organization left in the Black community. None. No political organization left. The Black United Front was closed down in 93. I have the date in here somewhere or whatever. It was closed without a whimper. The Black community didn't feel that Buff was relevant to their needs, and so when the government pulled the funding, the community said nothing. It just died. We do have a new political organization starting, UJAMA. I've been the chairperson of that, and it's designed to be a political organization, but it's just starting to get its feet and its legs under it. There is no political organization in the Black community. In terms of the role of the church is, in my opinion, schizophrenic. On one hand, the church is trying to lead a secular movement, trying to deal with secular issues, but by the same time, as they're dealing with these secular issues, they're putting it in the context of Christianity to such an extent that those who are not Christians end up not participating. And at this time in the community, we have different people from many different religions. Particularly, we have more and more Black Muslims. And I don't mean Black Muslims like Malcolm X Black Muslim, but Muslims who are Black in our communities. So that we in our community are now completely, I think, disorganized and without leadership. And it's a shame to say that you know, I'm speaking here at this particular time to say that we are without leadership. So what do I see as a solution? What I see as a solution resides with the younger people in our society. I think that those of us who lived back in the 60s and formed leadership in the 60s and did things in the 60s are passé. I think that we've taken a good shot at it, but a lot has not been done that perhaps could have been done. And that there's a need now for the same young, energetic leadership that we provided back then. The difficulty is that we don't seem to be getting that leadership either in the European community or in the Black community. You know, it's like the me first generation has really taken over. But the only solution, in my opinion, is if we can somehow or other encourage young people to come out and take the leadership to make these changes that are necessary. Because if we have young people who are prepared to stand up, to say, it's wrong that there are no people of color working in the stores primarily in Antigonish. It's wrong for the what has happened at the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, and it must be looked at. It's wrong that the percentage of black people going to jail or Aboriginal people going to jail is so much higher than that of the other larger community. And all of these things that are wrong, we need some young people who are prepared to take the leadership and to try to struggle and fight against them. Having said that, I want to close with saying we do have the power within our communities to shape minds, to educate, and to survive. As Marcus Garvey said, we are too large and great a people not to be, we are too large and great a people not to be a great people, a great race, and a great nation. We do have influence with progressive people, politicians and academics. And we as African descendant people need coalitions based on our power that we bring to the table. We need coalitions, but not takeovers. We need confrontation, which is essential for resolution. We need you, all of you. We just need you. I mean, it's the greatest need that I've, in all the years that I've been in this, right now is a time when there's the greatest need for the involvement of this larger community and our own community to change things, because it's so stagnant and it's almost hopeless, but we do have power. Thank you. Thank you.
Is there anyone who has a question for Dr. Jones? No?
Wow.
He answered everything.
Or it didn't inspire anything. I don't know if I answered everything. Oh.
I would like to invite our Vice President of the Black Student Society to thank our speaker, Samantha Brown.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate you coming out. I just wish there was a better turnout. And
Oh.
I thank you, because I think we're done that hard fight. It's just the cleaning up now that we have to do. And I'm 19 and I got 40 more under my belt, at least I think. my son takes a couple years off, but I promise I'll stay here just to make the change if I have to.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for staying so long. I know that you didn't expect it, but it was a great night. You got to have more of them.
After the War of 1812, we learned our lessons and we learned the well. Dempsey, the man from the SPG, he taught us all our ABCs. He was the leader of our community, and he talked the way things ought to be. Oh, Dempsey, Dempsey Jourdan, oh, Dempsey, Dempsey Jourdan. Oh, some of the colors of the Catholic Church, and Dempsey said it's all right to search, but the Catholics chase the colors away. And Dempsey said, well, that's okay. We can build the church that we can call our home, and we'll pray to God all on our own. Oh, Dempsey, Dempsey Jourdan. Oh, Dempsey, Dempsey Jourdan. It was after the War of 1812. We learned our lessons and we learned it well. Dempsey, the man from the SPG, he taught us all our ABCs. He was the leader of our community, and he talked the way things ought to be. Oh, Dempsey, Dempsey Jourdan. Oh, Dempsey, Dempsey Jourdan. Oh, Dempsey, Dempsey